All right. Welcome, everyone. This is the pre-recorded lecture on verbal behavior for Liz's study hour. This topic will be split into 3 different parts. Each will have its own recorded lecture and practice questions. This way it splits up this really complicated topic into smaller, more digestible chunks. If you are watching this on YouTube, be sure to head over to the learning platform to find those practice questions, as well as the downloadable content like PowerPoints and practice worksheets. You can find the link in the description. All right, let's get started. For part 1, we're going to be examining verbal behavior in general, helping give you an overall context and terminology for verbal behavior, like why do we study verbal behavior and what's so important about it? So why is verbal behavior important? Well, most of us are working with humans, and verbal behavior is something that Skinner believed to be central to many critical aspects of human behavior. To truly understand human behavior, you will need to understand verbal behavior. Also, a majority of you watching this are likely going to be working clinically with children who have a delay in their development. Now, verbal behavior is full of behavioral cusps. There's lots of skills that help a child access new worlds of reinforcement. So it's really important that we learn what these skills are, how they work, what the function is in a child's life, so we can better teach them. And it's important to remember that, if a child or a person in general can't communicate, then negative behavior may serve to fill that communication function. And function is where we begin. So there are 2 ways to talk about and analyze language. Historically, there have been 2. There's been function, which is Skinner's approach, which hopefully by now you are already familiar with this word because it is embedded through all of behavior analysis. We take a very functional approach, and this is basically the why or the meaning behind it, or really it's defining that contingency that the behavior is operating in. The other way that language has been historically analyzed is topographically, or form. This is more of a way of describing the behavior or the parts of speech, such as grammar, syntax, things like that. So let's look at an example to really understand this a little bit better. So a flashlight. What would you say the topographical description of a flashlight is? Well, you might say in this example that it's black, it's cylindrical, it's heavy, it has a battery in it, a button in it, the top swivels. Cool. If I gave you that description, you could look at this picture and identify what I'm talking about. But you might not be able to explain, the function of a flashlight. What's the purpose of it? So usually with a flashlight, what is a flashlight for? You're describing the contingency that we use flashlights in. So when it is dark, the antecedent, we turn on the light, that's the behavior, and we have a consequence of now we can see better. So that's the difference between topography and function in a very general example. The function gives us more of the purpose of something. The same can be done with communication, with a verbal behavior. So here's an example. We have a speaker behavior here of brown bear, what do you see? That's us asking brown bear, what do you see? And then we have brown bear's response, I see a red bird looking at me. So let's look at this topographically. Those in linguistics and some of those more historical ways of analyzing language would kind of break this down. They might look at the grammar, the syntax, the phonemes, things like that. They might point out there's pronouns, adjectives, nouns, verbs, prepositions here. Whereas Skinner's more functional approach looks at more what's the purpose of these statements. So asking brown bear, what do you see? That's a demand. We're asking for information. And brown bear's response of, I see a red bird looking at me. That's an intraverbal response as well as a tact. So mand, intraverbal, and tact are verbal operants. They, like I said, describe the function. It's a classification of function, whereas these are classifications of topography or form. And we'll get into verbal operants in part 2, so don't worry about them for now. But this is just a way to show you the difference between topography and function when we're talking about verbal behavior. And function is our approach to verbal behavior in behavior analysis, and even in speech language pathology uses the function of verbal behavior too when teaching language. We'll get into why. Verbal behavior is a dance. Now, why do I say that? Well, Skinner defines verbal behavior as behavior that is reinforced through the mediation of another person. And what does that really mean? It's behavior that we engage in gets reinforced from another person. So rather than, I'm thirsty, I engage in a behavior to grab my drink and take a drink, I'm being reinforced on my own through the environment. Whereas, verbal behavior, I can say, hey, can you pass me my drink? Somebody else would pass it to me. So I'm getting reinforced through another person. And I like to conceptualize this as a dance. I actually think this conceptualization came from Skinner in his book, Verbal Behavior. But I really like this concept, and it's really stuck with me. Now, it's a dance between a speaker and a listener. Now, this is important because these words, speaker and listener, are going to come up a lot in the next couple of videos too. So let me define them really quick. So a speaker within a verbal episode, we'll get into that too. A speaker is somebody who emits a verbal response. So any sort of verbal response, whether that's vocally or through sign language, text, anything like that, as long as it's a verbal response, that person is behaving as a speaker. But there's also someone who's behaving as a listener. And that someone is serving as an audience member. They're the ones that are going to be providing the reinforcement that the speaker is, depending on what verbal operant it is, what they're asking for. The listener is also going to be the one to respond to the speaker's verbal behavior. And that's where kind of like the dance comes in. It's a back and forth. So before you learn about verbal behavior, everything you've kind of learned about has been looking at the individual analysis level, those ABCs. You learn about one behavior and how to analyze one behavior. And you see the antecedents that come before it, maybe the motivating operations that are at play, and then the behavior, and then the consequences that come after it. And it's very individualistic. And we do a great job at analyzing people on an individual basis. So for example, we can see this one person dancing. We can, assess what skills they may be missing and develop interventions to improve their skills. But if we're leaving out the reality that, in real life, we're never dancing by ourselves, or hardly ever, we're interacting with people all the time. And we have to use our, communication all the time. We have to dance back and forth with people constantly throughout our lives. If we forget about that and we don't, teach him dance skills that are going to help him with dancing with other people, we're kind of doing a disservice. So remember, verbal behavior is a behavioral cusp. We talked about this earlier in this presentation. Learning verbal operants opens up a new world of reinforcement. Remember, a behavioral cusp is something that provides you with new access to reinforcement. So if you're a baby, for example, once you learn to crawl, now you've opened up your world to a ton more reinforcement. Same with learning how to walk. Now you can reach even higher levels and access more reinforcement that way. You can even move faster. Same with learning to talk. You know, you're opening up a whole new world. You can ask for things. You can do so many more things once you're able to talk. So it's huge. It's a very big behavioral cusp. It's very important that, you know, we're not just teaching in a one-directional way. When you're teaching verbal behavior, we must remember that we aren't just teaching our clients how to talk, we're also teaching them how to listen. So that's where, you know, there is a speaker behavior, yes, but there's also all of these listener behaviors that we're going to need to teach our clients as well. All right. So what are the takeaways here? So the first one, verbal behavior is a functional approach to language. It's not just the topographical approach anymore. We are looking at the function, the purpose. Verbal behavior leads to those cusps that we're talking about. It's opening up a whole new world, new ways of accessing reinforcement, because now instead of just having to do everything yourself, you can ask other people, engage with other people. And it's that dance between a speaker and a listener. So while you're a speaker engaging in, you know, verbal behavior, a listener will be your audience member. They will provide you some form of reinforcement and then they'll respond. They may even become a speaker themselves. So it's this back and forth, this dance that you're always going through whenever you're engaging with other people. All right, the next video is part 2, and this is where we will dive into the specifics of the verbal operants and learn a little bit more about what it really means to be a speaker and the job of a listener.